In 1967, Israel faced an existential threat like never before. Surrounded by powerful enemies and with the countdown to war already underway, a nation fought not only for its survival, but for its very existence. In a conflict that lasted only 6 days, witness the incredible story of courage, strategy, and determination that led Israel to victory in the Six-Day War. An epic battle that redefined the history of the Middle East. Since its founding, the State of Israel has faced significant threats to its existence. In fact, in the year of its official establishment in 1948, a coalition of 7 Arab countries joined forces to destroy the Jewish state. Israel won the war and managed to establish itself as a nation in the region, beginning a period of intense friction with its neighbors. 19 years later, in 1967, these tensions led to an unprecedented escalation, as you can see on the map of the region. In addition to the Mediterranean Sea, Israel also has an outlet to the Red Sea, but this outlet requires passage through the Strait of Tiran, a strategic region located between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, nations that in 1960 were declared enemies of Israel. The Egyptian president at the time, Gamal Abdel Nasser, a populist and nationalist leader who dreamed of unifying the Arab world under his leadership, had been threatening Israel for several years with the closure of the Strait of Tiran, something that would be tremendously detrimental to the country's economy. War preparations began a year earlier, in 1966, when Egypt and Syria signed a mutual defense pact, with Jordan joining the alliance in May 1967. With these pacts, Israel found itself in a very delicate military situation, surrounded by nations with mutual defense agreements, which effectively meant that fighting one of them would result in a widespread war against all. In May 1967, President Nasser's threats became a reality when Egypt closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli ships. This move was prompted by a false report delivered by the Russians, indicating that the Israelis were massing troops on the Syrian border, which was not true. It is still unknown whether this Russian report was premeditated or a failure of intelligence services. In addition to closing the strait, Egypt deployed several divisions to the Israeli border along the Sinai Peninsula, with Iraq sending a large expeditionary force to Jordan, publicly declaring its participation in a potential war against Israel. Syria followed suit, positioning thousands of troops along the Golan Heights in preparation for a coordinated attack. In early June 1967, Israel was surrounded by 150,000 Egyptians to the south and 300,000 Jordanians, Iraqis, Syrians, and other Arabs to the east and northeast. At that time, Israel had 50,000 active soldiers, 215,000 reservists, 300 combat aircraft, and 700 armored vehicles. Faced with this situation, Israel had only one option: to strike first. This is how, on June 5, 1967, exactly at 7:45 a.m., 178 Israeli fighter jets out of a total of 200 took off and attacked air bases inside Egypt. The Israelis followed a route along the Mediterranean Sea, entering Egypt from the rear and flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection, catching the Egyptians completely off guard. According to some sources, nearly 340 Egyptian fighter bombers were destroyed on the ground, which was virtually the entire Egyptian Air Force at the time. In just 30 minutes, the Israeli Air Force destroyed over 90% of the Egyptian Air Force at the cost of only 3 downed and 4 damaged planes. More than 90 MiG-21 fighters at the time, one of the most modern and feared in the world, were destroyed on the ground. At the same time, while this aerial attack was taking place, 35,000 Israeli soldiers, supported by 30,000 reservists and 500 armored vehicles, advanced against the more than 100,000 Egyptian soldiers and 900 armored vehicles entrenched in the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. The Israelis approached the border during the night, catching the Egyptians off guard again, as they expected the Israelis to concentrate on the northern border with Syria. The Israeli advance through the Sinai Peninsula was swift and relentless, with armored and mechanized columns crossing Egyptian lines at multiple points. Entire Egyptian army units were surrounded and surrendered in a matter of minutes, with many confused soldiers facing the Israeli presence. For most of the day, the Egyptians were unable to coordinate a defense line. with Israeli columns advancing in almost all areas towards the interior of the Sinai. By the end of the day, the Israelis reached a triple defensive line set up with Egyptian artillery pieces. At 10 p.m., this line was subjected to an artillery barrage with over 6,000 shells fired in just 20 minutes, considered the largest artillery attack in the history of the Israeli army. Simultaneously, with the Israeli Air Force dominating the skies, Egyptian armored columns and infantry were attacked from the rear, preventing reinforcement of the front line. On the following day, June 6th, a city was attacked by the 38th Israeli Armored Division, commanded by Major General Ariel Sharon, resulting in a bloody urban battle. By the end of the day, the region was captured at the cost of 14 dead and 41 wounded on the Israeli side, compared to 300 dead and over 100 Egyptian prisoners. With the defeat in Al Arish and the loss of its air force, President Nasser ordered the withdrawal of all Egyptian forces from the Sinai Peninsula, but no detailed instructions were given. As a result, the withdrawal was desperate and disorganized, with Egyptian soldiers being pursued and massacred by the advancing Israelis, who moved cohesively and uniformly throughout the region. According to some sources, in just 2 days, more than 10,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed, with thousands more dying of hunger, thirst, and sunstroke in the desert. On the night between June 7th and 8th, only 3 days after the start of the war, the Israeli army reached the Gulf of Aqaba and the Suez Canal, capturing the entire Sinai Peninsula and surrounding the remaining Egyptian army in the northernmost region. Against the Jordanian, Iraqi, and Syrian armies, the Israeli strategy was to remain on the defensive. However, President Nasser, realizing his imminent defeat, and after only 24 hours of war, sent false reports to the Jordanians indicating that the Egyptians were winning the war. In this report, President Nasser also requested that the Jordanian, Syrian, and Iraqi armies advance from the north to make the victory even more complete. At 10:30 a.m. on June 5th, when practically the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, Israel sent a message to King Hussein of Jordan asking him to stay out of the war. The Jordanian king's response came too late because the die was cast. Motivated by President Nasser's false report, the Jordanian king condemned the advance of his forces at 11:15 a.m. on June 5th. In response, Israel attacked Jordanian bases at 1 p.m., just as the planes were refueling, resulting in complete carnage and the destruction of almost the entire Royal Jordanian Air Force. On the ground, Israel advanced and surrounded Jerusalem, resulting in a bloody urban battle, with Jordanian forces entrenched in almost all buildings in the city. Between June 5th and 7th, the Jerusalem region witnessed fierce battles, as did the entire triple border area between Israel, Syria, and Jordan. The Syrians, also motivated by President Nasser's false report, joined the offensive, but their advance was immediately halted by Israeli forces in the region, with the Syrians limiting themselves to shelling Israeli cities and villages near the border. In the Golan Heights, intense battles took place in urban areas and fortified positions, with the Israelis using submachine guns to their advantage against the Syrians armed with AK-47 assault rifles, which were better suited for open combat. 6 days after the war began, Israel had captured the entire Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and some other territories belonging to Jordan and Syria. In total, about 1,000 Israeli soldiers were killed and 4,500 were wounded. Among the Arabs, the number of dead was around 15,000, with more than 20,000 wounded and tens of thousands taken prisoner. A shameful armistice was signed by the Arabs on June 10th, with Israel emerging victorious, leaving behind an Egyptian army practically in ruins. The sacred sites for Jews in Jerusalem were regained, with the Western Wall from which they had been expelled in 1948. 9 days after their resounding victory, Israel offered to return all the conquered territories to Egypt and Syria in exchange for the recognition of Israel's existence. However, in September 1967, the collective Arab response was clear. No Arab country will recognize Israel. There will be no peace, and there will be no negotiation. Meanwhile, the entire Soviet bloc severed diplomatic relations with Israel, immediately beginning the reconstruction of the Egyptian army that had been destroyed in the war. The determination of the Arab states not to recognize the State of Israel and not to negotiate with the Jews would lead to a new war a few years later, the so-called Yom Kippur War in 1973, which will be highlighted here on the channel shortly. With the Arabs' refusal to recognize Israel's existence, the Sinai Peninsula was only returned to Egypt in 1978, following the Camp David Accords mediated by the United States. The Israeli army officially withdrew from the Gaza Strip only in 2005. The Six-Day War once again showed that a war is not decided by numbers alone, but by how actions are coordinated and executed. Many of the operations carried out by Israel in this war are still studied and analyzed in military academies worldwide, serving as an example of how a smaller military force, even when surrounded, can achieve victory with determination, rigor, and resolve. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and share it with your friends. If you liked this video, you'll also enjoy the video I'm recommending on your screen right now. Leave your thoughts in the video comments. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.